All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the webinar in the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group of the International Social Capital Association. My name is Dr. Jeff Donaldson. I am the Secretary of the Board of Directors of the association, and as well, I am the Chair of the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group. The International Social Capital Association is an international not-for-profit founded in New Zealand, and it is our goal to spread the use and knowledge of the social capital theory, which essentially is the value retained in the human networks that we have across a number of domains. This is one of three special interest groups that exist. The first one is on the general theories of social capital, and the new one that's actually starting this Friday is on the measurement of social capital. So bringing together ideas and scholars who think about, we know the power of social capital and the value of it, but how do we measure its presence? How do we measure it now? And then how do we measure it a little bit later down the line to see whether the trend line is up or the trend line is down in social capital? So they exist. The association has a small annual fee to join, but we do offer our Mighty Networks Connection online platform free of charge for anyone. Throughout this webinar, I will be putting notes in the chat about what's going on in the ISCA and the Special Interest Group for those of you and connections to check with it. But tonight, it is my pleasure to be here to talk about the power of social capital and assisting those affected by wildfire. It is my sincere pleasure to be joined by Sharon Back as our fellow panelist. And just before I get Sharon to introduce her, just a house note. If for whatever reason we get disconnected, we've had some power bumps in the area today due to some peak weather. Welcome to climate change. If that happens, then just pause for a couple of minutes and log back in. We'll just restart the meeting. And with that, Sharon, if you could take a second to introduce yourself to the group, and then we'll kick off with our first point of discussion.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate you having me. My name is Sharon Back. I live in Thunder Bay, which is on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. I am a registered social service worker, and I've also spent the last 30 years while I was doing that, working in emergency management and what was formerly known as disaster management. I've been everything from a volunteer medical first responder, humanitarian aid worker, and an emergency management field officer for the province of Ontario. And I now run my own business consulting for mental health and emergency management. So thank you, Jeff.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and I'm glad you. We're going to talk a lot about some ideas about vulnerable populations and experiences, and I think it's important because sometimes we have to talk about the difficult things that are happening and the difficult things that are happening within our communities and the value of social capital and how we can help out with that. So most of our questions are going to be fairly generic tonight. I just warn everybody, we are going to be talking about people suffering from chronic illnesses or things from dislocated occurrences that happen when you're evacuated, or as we prefer to call them, displaced persons. I'll try my best to use a better set of nomenclature, but when I use evacuees, please understand what I really mean is displaced person. And with that, just a question to start off, Sharon, if you could talk a bit about your experience in assisting populations in emergencies. I'm just trying to understand in your area of Ontario and Canada, the demand, the need. What is the level of need in our ongoing?
Yeah, no, thank you. So most of my experience has been with being a host community in Thunder Bay for many, many years, and I was with the Red Cross, so I ran those responses. I've also been to Saskatchewan and Alberta, and my portfolio really was assisting Indigenous communities that were displaced or were staying in their community but needed support. So with that, obviously, comes a lot of social vulnerabilities because those communities are often in what we call social emergencies now. We didn't have a term for it back then, and so when you add a evacuation or a shelter in place because of an emergency component, that heightens a lot of things that are already happening. I've also had the opportunity domestically to support individuals One, for example, was the city of Thunder Bay in 2012 had a major flood, and several of the communities that were affected by it were people with low income, maybe were on disability supports, didn't have a lot of social connections necessarily. Mental health and addictions were amplified during that time. And so, and even for myself, I will say I utilized my own support network in my life with mental illness, and I'm very open about it. And I have been, have had to look for support during emergency times for myself. I found out a year after the flood that I had been affected by the flood. I was so busy volunteering that I didn't realize my furnace had flooded. And the next year, we got a snowstorm, and I realized I was affected, and I had to be put up by the Red Cross in a hotel and get support because I did not have financial capabilities at the time to do so myself. So I've had, this, I say it's an honor to be on both sides because it gives me a huge perspective on what the people I've supported have gone through and are going through, and then the people that being there myself and feeling that vulnerability and having to access services and supports. The other piece that I think is super important is that everyone's vulnerable during an evacuation. There's an inherent risk in evacuations, no matter what they are. What I focus a lot on is those who have pre-disaster vulnerabilities, I call them, right? So folks who already are struggling day to day and then have to deal with a huge emergency. So a lot of the emergencies I've been involved with over time have been people who came out, we call them primary evacuees from far north communities, which is the most vulnerable: elderly, children, people with medical issues, things like that. So that's been my experience, and quite honestly, been a great joy to me to see how my own social capital, my own network, could help support some of those individuals. And I've been doing it as recently as just over the last 2 weeks with some of the evacuations we've had, and helping some families and some people that I know that have been evacuated from the far north that are very dear friends of mine, and people that unfortunately we're maybe falling through the cracks, which often happens. And that is the work that I do now, is to try to identify where those cracks are and try to build a safety net so that people don't fall through them. So my experience has mostly been with individuals who needed some additional supports and services, and then also working with huge, wonderful teams, whether it was in municipalities, whether it's been different levels of government, private sector, non-governmental organizations, things like that.
And I greatly appreciate your broad spectrum of experience and work. When we think about perspective, I think is important because, like you've said, being on one side of mental illness and then being on the other, the caregiver side of the mental illness, as well as your perspective of having personally gone through a number of the experiences, you can't mirror exactly the experiences that the affected population is going through, but you can understand why they may be apprehensive, why they may be stressed in front of you, and understand why these situations may exist for them when somebody who doesn't have the level of experience of what it's like to go through this type of rapid onset or no notice household evacuation where you're moved, or had some other experience similar to that might have generated those type of emotional response. It's about a lot of it, I simply put, is about the experience of humanity and uncertainty, and us being a gregarious animal, a tribal population where we traditionally rely on each other. Just a question for you to reflect on: do you think there's been a notable increase in maybe not one hazard versus another hazard? I know we're talking about wildfires tonight, but that's just a great frame to use considering the situation we're in. Have you, do you believe there's a notable increase or a trend upwards of the number of people on an annualized basis or on a regional basis who are requiring types of assistance that you offer or that you're involved in related to any type of hazard?
Oh, absolutely. When I first started 30 years ago, my career, if you will, we maybe had a big emergency that we supported once every 2 years or something like that. Now we've got events happening not just throughout the year, but simultaneously. Right now we have these evacuations from wildfires going on, and they're horrific. Then we just had we're not sure if it's a tornado or not, but a microburst down, probably at least in the Northeast, near the Mattawa area. And we don't have the resources to respond to it as effectively as we can. I think everybody's trying, but yeah, we have a huge increase in need, a huge increase in something that becomes threat to life. We saw that in 2011 when we had thousands of people evacuated from the far north. I was part of the hub in Thunder Bay, supporting that, and now we have, this year in Ontario more than we had during that time that have come out, multiple communities that have come out, very large communities that have come out, and all at the same time. So yes, it is getting more and more complex, more and more people affected. And I think also the services and supports and the structures have not evolved to change to be able to rapidly support that and be available to people as quickly and as necessary as needed. So the need is growing as well as we go through these numerous more numbers of evacuations and displacements and emergencies.
And so when you see the type of needs, I think a lot of the chatter that I do read in some of the online communities that talk about wildfire displaced populations and the issues surrounding their displacement and return, et cetera, much of it is filled by uninformed individuals. But have you seen an increase in the same type of populations that are affected, or have you seen the affected population broaden? And what I'm just trying to understand is we know, and I think it's generally accepted, and you've said it, that the number of people affected by wildfires and displacement is increasing. All
Mhm.
hazards is being increasing. Are we seeing I guess, a demographic shift in that, or is it just more of the same population, or are we starting to see new emerging parts of the population that might not have been affected in the past, but are affected now?
Oh, I think we definitely are seeing a mix. I mean, I say, traditionally we've, it's been mostly the indigenous communities in the far north coming down, but we have seen things like when I was a field officer, Pickle Lake, a remote municipality, fire came literally lapping to their back door. We saw Red Lake 2 years in a row had a fire lapping at their door. The first year they evacuated thousands of people, and it looked like the Fort Mac scenario. There was fire along the sides of the road as they were driving out. So I'm seeing definitely that, we've got population, in different parts, and maybe it's a small population up here, but we are seeing things that are happening to areas that traditionally we didn't have a lot of response to. Now there's a lot of push for things like fire smart so that people will be more prepared and hopefully mitigate some of that. But the reality is that there is more and more fires, there's change in the climate, things dry up sooner, and we're seeing multiple things at the same time. The other thing we're seeing is critical infrastructure failures. Infrastructure is getting old. We've seen a lot of water treatment plant issues and things like that. So we've had evacuations for that reason. And then we've seen an increase, at least I believe in my time, an increase in severe weather events, right? So things that take out highways for a period of time, campgrounds getting cut off, like we've seen. That's not the first time that's happened. It's just it's a bigger scale than what we've seen in a while. So we've and because a lot of lens isn't up in Northern Ontario when these things happen, because we're fairly resilient, we kind of take care of things. They're not, they don't necessarily hit the media in Southern Ontario very often. People don't often hear about them. Where I grew up in my small community of Pass Lake, at one point there was a flood in the drive to the provincial park, and campers were stuck for days. And it was honestly no big deal. People, they figured it out. We figured it out. It's just the way it worked. But I do see a change. I also see that there's more and more populations whether they're municipal, unincorporated First Nations, that when folks are displaced, they are in need of more services. The anxiety is higher, and especially the further away from home they are sent, the higher the anxiety that I'm seeing. Also, we know that there's three kinds of folks that we deal with when people have emergencies and are displaced: people who are totally fine on their own, the people who need help right from the start, and then the middle part, which can grow quite considerably, is those who were okay for a little bit and now are running out of food, now are running out of money, and become vulnerable. And that increases anxiety, increases supports. We talk a lot about where are the beds and where are the places people can go, but we need to be much better, I think, at the wraparound supports that have to go with it. And that is where you build your networks and your capital and your trust ahead of time so that those things can be pull together in an instant. I'm working with a community right now who's building an emergency social services plan, and part of it is engaging all the external system partners so that they can have a standing group that when response time happens, it's a quick call, that task force is together and they know each other and they can be ready, and you know what they can do and you know what they can't do, which takes a lot of time off your plate.
It does. It does. And we're going to get to the
Yes.
destination community in a little bit, but I think a great transition to our next subject is you've spoken eloquently about the fact that social problems exist in all of our communities, and
Mhm.
when we pick up that community and have to evacuate it and move it somewhere else, those social problems come with it. They're not evaporated by the fact that they're not in their location. As you said, they're likely exasperated. They're likely made more prevalent or more harsh for the affected population. I'm just wondering on your idea or your commentary, your experience on the strength of the social capital in the affected population when it gets to move to its destination. How important is the inter-community connections of the displaced population in influencing their success at the destination?
It, so it is key. And I'm going to tell you two things that I've seen. I've seen it go really well and I've seen it go really bad. And I won't name the communities out of respect because it was just things that got overlooked. But one community who was evacuated, it was a municipality, flew some people to a larger community for support. They didn't send a liaison with them. They didn't send anyone with them. And they were just kind of left. They had no information. They didn't have hygiene kits. They had what they had on their backs. And luckily, a person from that community was in the host community, was able to help them out and make some engagements. And I had a field officer that I engaged to kind of support with that as well. So, when we forget and we just get beds for people, right? That's one of those things. The other side of it I've seen is, for example, the work that's been done between the federal government, the provincial government, and various entities for supporting Indigenous evacuations. And I've seen communities where it is Indigenous led, but municipal supported, right? So the community is got kind of control of the whole thing, the host community, the municipality, if you will, or whatever community it is supporting it. They're providing resources and time, but the lead is with the actual leadership of the community. And that ensures that we retain that social capital that comes from their communities, because all of these communities already have networks, right? And we're disrupting their network because we have to for life safety reasons. But the more we can ensure that the people who are part of those communities remain in charge, remain connected to the community by whatever means, uh, keep families together. Oftentimes, we know families get torn apart during major evacuations. I saw it happen in 2011. We were transferring people like you wouldn't believe, but it was because family reunification was such an important part of keeping those folks together. Now, when we are doing some of those evacuations, it's a standard within the standards that are set to say, if the most vulnerable are coming out first, make sure there's at least one caregiver, if not a family unit, that comes with them to make sure. So we've recognized the need to keep those folks together as much as possible and be able to sustain that social capital that happens already in the communities naturally. And what I would like to see is a recognition that a lot of these communities, they already have huge, great, wonderful people that are natural leaders, right? Who know what the needs are and that we support them. And this wonderful gentleman I spoke about who kind of handled, took it on himself to support the people that were sitting in a hotel with no information. That is a wonderful example of someone who stepped up and should be supported to step up and do that, right? So I think we are doing better, um, but we've got some ways to go, and there's some gaps that I've seen even recently.
And I've talked to a couple of there's always a couple of lenses, and I find it, like you mentioned earlier, perspective is so important. When you're in charge of the actual physical evacuation, your lens is get everybody that needs to get out and has to get out and get them to a safe destination. When you're a member of when you're a leader in the community, it's how do I make this as less stressful and less anxious as I can for my people, knowing we need to do this and we don't have a choice? Especially if some of the community remains behind to try to
Mhm.
fight the wildfire, that adds additional stress to the family members who have evacuated. And I often wonder about the power of the internal social capital, but what we refer to as bridging social capital, the connection between the community organizations that exist in, say, Red Lake or Pickle Lake, and the governance of Pickle Lake. Because in some of these rural areas, as you know, living in rural Ontario, and we've got a section later, we're going to talk about the urban versus rural divide. There always is this challenge of there's a difference between urban governance and the relationship with the population versus municipal governance. And do you see strong governance is an effective support for social capital and evacuation?
I do. I do. Now, I'm going to put the caveat on that, though. Strong government, as long as it's not done in what I'll kind of say is a top down, we're in charge kind of way, right? I've seen that on many occasions, and it just makes people feel like they're under control, right? When they're already feeling out of control, and then you try to put control on them instead of empower them and support them, right? That changes the dynamic. Now, I will say, I mean, I love Northwestern Ontario, and I know quite a few of the leaders in the community. They really want to do good work, right? And they really want to try hard, and they jump into action and they help each other out. Absolutely. But yes, I think governance, it has a place. And the other part of it is that, I really really would like to see the municipalities do more promotion and support to, or not promotion and support, promotion and advocacy to get more emergency managers, to build those bridges, to have these committees, but they don't have the funds, they don't have the resources. There's not one full-time community emergency management coordinator in a Northwestern Ontario municipality when there should be like 10 in just my city, right? So when you I think sometimes what people do is they take the governance and think, oh, I'm in charge and I've got to make everything perfect, and I don't, and I'm gonna silo off, right? That's not the way to do it. Strong government with working with those bridges and having that ahead of time. The most we can do is, response is the sexy thing, right? Everybody wants to see that. But to me, the most important thing after this long in my career is actually the stuff that happens before, as well as recovery, which we really stink at in the world. Really, we don't do a great job of recovery at all, and transitioning people back to a new normal. But if we had these groups and had these bridges already, and we're not trying to figure it out on the fly, imagine what we could do, and we could bridge that gap to recovery so much better and use the same people that we have trust with and time with. So that's kind of my, I know it's a lot of thoughts, but it's not just governance, it's the use of the governance, and how it's used.
And that's exceptionally important. But I would agree with you that it's the level of connection and the sense of belonging. And I think this is a great transition into our discussion point on the rural versus urban
Mhm.
divide. My experience, having moved all around this wonderful country when I was a member of the military for 28 years, I was dropped in rural communities, I was dropped in urban centers, suburban areas. I've had the opportunity over decades to live in both, and I can understand the fact that in most rural places, the governance, the leadership of the community, even in the First Nation sense, are truly residents and your friend. Like the city councilor really is also, by the way, is owns the shop in town. And oh, by the way, is the volunteer assistant deputy fire chief at the same time. Like there
Yeah.
are so few people who assume any type of leadership role within rural communities that they often end up being very familiar, very well known, etc. And the difference, though, I live in the city of Ottawa, Ontario. It's about 1.2 million people. And I don't think very many population in this city could pick their city councilor out of a lineup. If you did a
Mhm.
police style lineup and put the city councilor, maybe the mayor, we've got a popular mayor, but other than that, the city councilors who make all of these rules and would be part of the solution, most don't know. So you see that difference. What do you think? from your experience, that social capital relationship and network that you talk about is so important, and I couldn't agree more. What are the differences that you found between a rural setting and an urban setting?
So I'm lucky that I grew up in a rural setting. I grew up halfway between Thunder Bay and Nipigon, about an hour away, in a community that was what we call unincorporated, which didn't have a governance structure. So I grew up, yeah, kind of sheltered in many ways. I mean, pretty much stayed in the country. But what I saw there, and what I now know is social capital, but couldn't articulate it then, was the way people responded, right? The way, when something happened, everybody jumps in. When there's a crisis or a death or something, everybody jumps in. And there, what we have to remember about rural communities is that, and especially I'm going to say Northern Ontario, the most under-resourced, underfunded part of Ontario, they know how to do a lot with nothing because they work together. So there's a lot of already good synergies and things that are happening amongst these small communities because there's chunks of them that are kind of quite close together, right? So they work together. They can pick up the phone and be like, "Hey, Mr. Mayor, in the other community, can we get some help?" Um, so then I moved to Thunder Bay and was like, wow, okay, all of a sudden I'm living in an urban environment, much larger community. We would come here and shop, but now I'm living in it, right? So um, what I also see though is that and we have to remember that the few bigger communities that we have in these areas, they're the hub for resources for all of the other municipalities and unincorporated communities, and are often a hub for our Indigenous communities. So Lookout is a good example where, that's sort of a place that a lot of people go in the catchment area where health services are, right? And the hospital that's there. So there's definitely a difference between the two, but again, big area here, they all know one another, right? They all know one another. I will tell you that when I say that there's no full-time CEMC in any of our communities, the awesome part is that they all know each other and they know they can pick up the phone and call one another if something's hitting the fan. When Red Lake happened, I was the field officer. I was at home sitting at this very desk that I'm at now, making calls to municipalities. They thought I was kidding. I said thousands of people are driving out of Red Lake right now, and there's fire on the highway. They're like, yeah, whatever, Sharon. No, I'm for real. And they all stepped up. They all said they opened their doors. They said, we'll do whatever we can. City of Dryden opened a reception center right away. Vermilion Bay was trying to track people as they were coming out, things like that. So we know that capital exists, and we use it, which is great. Now, the problem is there's only so many people, double, triple hatted, quadruple hatted in some cases. There's been a definite change in resourcing, looking at pre-positioning resources. But still, if we're trying to get COTS to Kenora, it's a 6-hour drive, right? So where we pre-position those things so that people can have those comforts and have those things is another issue as well. So that's the difference between when I look at, even the rural urban divide here, but when we look at Northern Ontario as a whole and we look at the rest of Ontario, um, really huge difference in terms of if I'm in Toronto, I can go down the street and I can grab what I need, right? Whereas here, someone in Pickle Lake who needs a Walmart run, it's a 8-hour drive one way just to come and get it. So, trying to get resources and people moved around it's very, very challenging. But I think we're the most, and I say this with pride, I think we're the most creative people you've ever met because we are trying to do a bunch of stuff with nothing. I think the Northwest Response Forum that you joined me at is a great example. It's all done by volunteer time. From a variety of ministries, workplaces, public, private, sponsorship. We never have a problem. We always, sell out because it's something where people can come together and they appreciate it and they need that venue. And it's done by people that aren't trying to make money, right? We're just trying to cover our costs. And those are the kind of things that I see as really, really special, that we can build on and utilize to make not just response better, but planning and recovery.
And I want to get to that. How do we make it better? How do we leverage social capital? But I did want to ask you one last question about that divide between the two. And
Mhm.
what I'm thinking is if I'm a host or I'm a reception city, so I'm working with the reception center that the evacuees through one mode of transport or another are on the way to my community. Do you think the needs assessment is markedly different whether those individuals are coming out of a rural area or coming out of an urban area? And I think about some of the wildfires that we've had over the last couple of years in northern Alberta and Yellowknife. The needs of the people in rural Northwest Territories, which is essentially everywhere but Yellowknife.
Yeah.
Um, they're all coming down the same road, but do you think the populations themselves present with a similar needs requirement, whether they come from urban or rural?
Oh, I definitely think so. I definitely think so. I think that a lot of times some of the folks in the rural areas, they're better prepared in many ways, just because of their, day to day, they have, backup generators and different things. However, if they're displaced, right, they don't necessarily have that stuff with them. And, a lot of folks from rural might be used to, their work is in the bush cutting trees, and all of a sudden they can't do that. So there's a lack of financial, right? Urban, getting urban folks, I think is a little different too, because say they had to leave like a place like Thunder Bay, say Thunder Bay needed to evacuate, and all of a sudden they're in a small community and, Nipigon being put up for a bit, and there's not necessarily the resources and the supports that they're used to, right? So we do in our hazard assessment and even in our assessment of the special needs that we might see for different populations, vulnerable or not, we do have to look at that lens a little bit differently. We also have to look at, and I would love to see, something where there's like regional, in our case, kind of district support services and things like that, which are already set up for day to day, but not necessarily for emergencies, so that they would have perspective, right? These people sit on these boards and they're from all different kinds of jurisdictions. Some are rural, some are urban. So we can utilize those folks to kind of say, what could we do for planning wise? And what could we do during response that is maybe needs to be a little bit different depending on where people are coming from and where they traditionally live.
And that's really interesting because when we think about the connectivity or the connection between people and their community and we displace them, we often don't talk about the host city or the reception city and what
Mhm.
considerations. And I think this is a great transition to the last part before we move to for the next 10 minutes or so before we move to the question and answer period, is to really talk about understanding the value of social capital, understanding that we're dealing with individuals who are displaced, who have a number of pre-existing and hazard-induced social problems and things that need to be addressed. Where do you think a great starting point is to talk about what we can do at the reception city pre-event to think about what we would consider if we were nominated to be a reception city on a short to no notice evacuation? What kind of social capital networks, what kind of things could we leverage or set up in a lot of cases that don't currently exist, to be better prepared to support the evacuees when they do show up?
Well, one thing would be, in my opinion, regional or district planning. So I will tell you, when I started with Red Cross, it was actually a contract position. I was looking at all the emergency plans. Every emergency plan for all the communities in the Thunder Bay district said go to Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay didn't have that in their plan, right? And it's still to this day, a lot of the reception is go to Thunder Bay. What if Thunder Bay is evacuating? Where do they go? And has that been practiced? Has that been looked at? Right. So first of all, I think the regional district planning would be super important. We can build on some of the groups that are already there, like our district social services boards, as an example, who kind of oversee and have representation from all the communities. We we do no favors when we put stuff in our plan and then we don't share it with other people. We don't pick up the phone and say, hey, Thunder Bay, we're all coming there if something happens. What's your plan? And then there's also, we have to have the honest discussions about things like cost recovery, right? And getting those uncomfortable conversations out of the way ahead of time, so we can all say, okay, it's happening. Let's just focus on what we're doing, right? And what we need to do for people. And then looking at the community profiles, right? Like what does that look like? And why, why can't we build some district profiles of where the populations are and what type of population and get that data. Now it's hard and unincorporated to get stats because there's not really any governance there, but there are ways to get some of that information. Absolutely. And some of it's just literally sitting at the coffee shop and talking to people. Most of my career and the connections I've made that have allowed me to sort of help people in different situations has literally been me just sitting down and talking with people and listening to their stories and hearing what their thoughts and concerns are. And some people, I remember I was on a deployment to Saskatchewan at one point when they unfortunately look at evacuation every year. And I was with a staff who couldn't understand why I was sitting talking to someone who was one of the uh, evacuation coordinators when they had their major flood that really scared them. I mean, the runway was flooding as the Hercules was taking off. It was terrifying for them. And he was very frustrated. And I kind of explained to my colleague, I said, this is one of the best things we can do is just sit and listen and think of all the information we just gathered. We've heard about the fact that they're scared that this is going to happen again. We know now, I know now what that experience was like from his perspective, not mine, of course, but his perspective. So, yeah, I think regional planning, larger scale planning, having some kind of, I would love to see a regional operations center up here just for Northern Ontario and one in Northwest and one in Northeast would be hugely valuable because the local people know best, right? Having Toronto tell us what we should and shouldn't do, great, you give us some thoughts or whatever, but it has to be made at the local level. We know best our folks, we know best our communities, we know who the people are we need to talk to. And you know what? Sometimes, by golly, I don't care about the chain of command. I'm going to go to so and so because I know I can get something from them. And I've had my hand slapped and I'm totally fine with it because it was just what needed to get done at the time. So that, in terms of, I think it's just talking and seeing what the resources are. The other thing we have to keep in mind is we have, and I know it's across Ontario, but I will say there's different dynamics up here, a very stressed and in crisis every day health and social services system. Right. It is overwhelmed at the best of times. So there's a lot of communities now that aren't hosting anymore, or that now, Ontario's using third-party vendors and hosting in some communities, but a lot are going down south. And a lot of it is because the capacity in these communities is very, very small. So how can we build that up? How can we work together? How can we say, okay, if Thunder Bay is going to host, is there people from the different municipalities and communities around that could maybe step up to help and make that happen so that people are closer to home? Now, hundreds of kilometers up north is not close to home, but they're definitely more familiar with Thunder Bay than they are with, the city of Barrie, as an example. So I think it's a lot more talking and planning and having some key folks who can make those connections, but having a chance to really kind of look at what the capacity is and where there's gaps and how can we fill them. We know there's gaps. People talk about it all the time and say we don't have capacity, but what are we doing about it? Right. And so it has to be some advocacy at the other levels too. It's not just emergency management, but those everyday advocacy to say we don't have enough to begin with. How can we make sure people stay closer to home or in areas that they're more comfortable with by having capacity built and having people work more closely together.
And I think sometimes it works simply because somebody has resources and they can force it to work. Doesn't
Yeah.
mean it works eloquently, doesn't mean it works efficiently, or arguably maybe not even effectively, but because they have the resources. And I say this because I've spoken to some staff at the city of Toronto, the city of Mississauga, the city of Brampton, Peel region outside Toronto, and you would think a center of 4 to 6 million people, they could easily, without question, handle large scale evacuees, but they don't have it on their plate. They don't have anything set up in their community, and they haven't built those key social capital relationships with their emergency social service providers. What would it look like if I have to bring in 1,000 people into the city, and these thousands of people are coming with this set of pre-existing social challenges, and we're bringing them into our society, into our city. Big cities aren't necessarily any better prepared than Thunder Bay is. Thunder Bay may have, I think it's 120,000 people in it, and we have 10 times that in Ottawa. And I would say that we're more likely no more prepared to have a large scale influx of rapid onset evacuees. And I think that's important. But I do want to ask the question, in your experience, and you don't have to name them, describe them if you don't want to name the community, but do we have, maybe not a shining star because nobody does it perfectly. We all do the best that we can in the situation. But do we have a reasonably recent example of where these strong social capital networks were leveraged, evacuees were housed, and it went as well as we could expect it to go? In other words, we often talk about lesson learned from experiences as look at all of the things that didn't go well and we need to fix. Do we have a positive side that says, hey, we went through this experience in this community and it actually went very well, and here are the things that we should replicate and reinforce, vice just looking at it from the perspective of here are the things that didn't go well and this is what we need to improve upon? Do we have a fairly recent example of success, or am I hoping?
I'm going to say that I'm going to be careful here. There are really wonderful people doing really good work and trying really, really hard within systems and structures and procedures and standards that honestly are not set up the right way. And so we have had, I would say, success in terms of seeing the trend that I gave you earlier with the some of the host communities where it's Indigenous led, municipal supported, right? That's honestly not something I ever saw. Um, but what I'm saying is we always know it's chaos at the beginning when, especially a threat to life evacuation, it's chaos at the beginning, trying to get everything organized. You've got to get people out and get them safe. But what I'm not seeing is the wraparound supports happening quickly. I'm not seeing the wraparound supports being coordinated in the communities as they should be. I think people are trying, and maybe I'm kind of a naysayer at this point because I keep seeing the gaps. What I see is the same issues that we've been talking about for 30 years are still the same issues today. And so there are people falling through the cracks. And I would say there's a lot of really wonderful people that are trying really, really hard. I think I'm very proud of our communities up here. I really, really am. They do very little, or they do, they do a lot with very
Too
little,
little.
and how that was terrible to say, right? And but
We know what you
they
meant.
do
No
it.
worries.
Thank you. But they do, they do as much as they can, and they have overextended themselves on many, many, many occasions to help the folks that they need to help. But my thing is, they shouldn't have to. There should be teams that come in to support. There should be better building of the planning structure ahead of time so that we can make those quick calls. Now, have I seen a lot improve? Absolutely, I've seen a lot improve, but not enough to make me say that there's a bunch of successes. I have, even in the last 2 weeks, I've heard some things that I don't want to hear. I've seen people being moved because things weren't working in one community and they had to move to another. I had a grandmother with 2 grandkids. I had to go personally deliver them hygiene kits because they were staying with their family here. The mother had to stay here. She's very vulnerable. She didn't have anybody. The grandkids should not be at that age caregiving for her, and they were going to send her to Toronto. Now, because she chose to stay here, they're saying she can't receive services and support. I've been told today that she can go register apparently with the Red Cross, and we're trying to set that up. But I shouldn't have to be delivering hygiene kits to someone, or helping them buy groceries because they're not getting services and supports because it's outside this particular system. She's better off with her family, right? So those kind of gaps remain. I mean, social determinants of health, being around loved ones is huge. She's better cared for. She's less strain on the evacuation because if she had gone to Toronto, I guarantee you they would have been trying to find services and supports for her, and she would have probably not been doing well. And she's already struggling up here with feeling lonely and out of place out of her community. So I'm going to say the success is always that people are safe, right? Like, to me, that's always a success. But when I'm the actual evac and the wraparound supports, people are trying, it's getting better, but there's a lot of work to be done. And quite frankly, a lot of it is silos and money. And it really needs to stop. It can't be about that. We have to put people's needs first and lose those silos. And I'm still seeing them there. So I'm hopeful. I'm always trying to be hopeful, and I want to prop up the people who are doing really great work. But systems and structures are the same as they were 30 years ago and probably 30 years before that. They don't work. We need to come up with new ideas. That's why social capital is so important to me, because those connections and those relationships are what can help us. Patricia Martel said it really good at the forum. She said a response is really made or broken by how your most vulnerable are taken care of, right, or not taken care of. So that's what we need to focus on, is the people component, and I am going to keep pushing for that. And I know people are sick of hearing me say it, but I would rather support someone who's with grandma at home with her daughters and in a loving, supportive environment than worry about her down in Toronto by herself, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
that's where I'm going with it.
And I think, and I use this one case, and I won't bring any names, but there was one community that was evacuated this year where they had a pre-existing condition in the community of alcoholism, and they
Mhm.
had one trained counselor that was doing wonderful work, like you said, was building the social connections, getting to know the police department, and saying, there's other avenues other than arrest and detention. There's all
Mhm.
dies to deal with this. The challenge that was faced was the community was not all going to the same location. And she was forced as to which group do I go with to continue the support, and which group of my supported population do I have to abandon and hope that somebody else at the destination will be able to figure out supports, because um, addictions and vulnerable populations do draw a larger amount of resources in a disaster, and even greater in an evacuation. And if you can't bring the socially connected stats that are there, I'm just wondering. You've said it, and this is the last point we'll discuss, and then we'll go to the question and answer period. We've done this for 30 years. What is the biggest barrier to at least starting the relationships to getting these people to talk around the table? Because I know the money for programming is always going to be somewhat of a barrier to overcome. Emergency management doesn't win the day when it's fighting against healthcare and education and pharmacare and daycare at the cabinet table. I understand that. But isn't there a lot of work that could be done in building the social capital and building the human connections between all of these parties that know they're going to be part of this response operation? And I wish we had another hour to talk about recovery. You're absolutely right. That
I
is an
know.
abject nightmare, but we don't have the time for that. Maybe we can have you back for another panel when we talk about how recovery just is not done. But I'm really thinking, in your experience, especially in your area with a number of rural communities, why haven't we got these people together, at least to set up that network and those connections?
I'm going to say a lot of it has to do with capacity, human resource capacity, financial capacity, and the like. So we are, again, we're asked to do more and more all the time, right? These communities are, and then the ones that are municipalities are legislated to do A, B, and C, but no resources in people or money or time are coming with it. And so I think that's one of the biggest barriers, is people are tired. They don't have time to do this, right? Part of what I'm trying to do is, be like, pick me, and I'll try and do it. But that costs money for them too, right? So like, trying to, get this stuff done. If I had all the money in the world, I would go around and do it for free, and I do a lot pro bono, believe me, to try to help communities. But it's really like they don't have the resources and the time. So if we could build from the ground up in the community level and have these groups come together and start talking, but we had, maybe had a little bit of funds or grants or something that could support doing that. I would love to see sustainable funding for it, but building at the community level, it can be done. I've seen wonderful stories out of Australia as an example, where they involved the small community, they involved the whole group in the planning, and it was fantastic to see. And that's what I would like to see. We've got this provincial operations center, we've got this government operations center in Ottawa, and we kind of think like, okay, we call them and everybody helps. It's still all at the local level. We're not the US. We don't have FEMA swooping in. So what can we do at the local level to bring these people together and to have sometimes uncomfortable conversations about what's going on and about what we can and cannot do, and challenging the status quo, right? And I think that would be the ideal part, but they need time and resources and money to do it without raising municipal taxes to cover it all.
And I think that's part of the issue is that everybody will say it's a great idea until
Yeah.
the tax bill comes due and they're voting for the mayor and the councilor that says I'm going to hold taxes at 2% or at the cost of inflation or whatever it be. And they're also the same people who are calling for more and more services and more investment, not understanding generally that it comes from that. And I think you're right. I think it is the local level where it has to start. It's the local level, and when you have, and I just return to the stories that I read, and some of the research that I've done in southwestern Ontario during evacuations, just the vulnerable populations and people that through no fault of their own and through life socioeconomic struggles are facing a significant additional number of challenges in their life. And now they have to leave their home where whatever minimal services they had did exist into a receptive community. And this may be for a period of weeks. This isn't a weekend trip at Bernie's, right? This is somebody's can be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks without of the social supports. And then I guess one more thing that I think is important to talk about is the negative social capital that comes out of it, the negative externalities that come. There have been some stories about the effects of these new onset social problems on the receptive community who's not used to that prevalence
Mhm.
of that social ill and now kicks back and says it's time for all of you to go home, you're causing too much of a disturbance, etc.
Mhm.
And the number of those experiences are not zero, and I think it's worthy, and don't worry if anybody has to go, I apologize, we'll take questions and answers after. But what are your thoughts on, do you see a growing resentment at all in the fact that these populations are continuously and repeatedly being evacuated to the same place or adding extra demands onto the already precarious social structures?
I would say that it's always been there. There's systemic racism and bias within everything that's done. Um, I think it goes in peaks and valleys where some story will come out and a bunch of people will jump on it. But I think in this day and age with the social media and people being able to be keyboard warriors, right, and say what they want, there's a lot of really horrible things that are said. I mean, how many times have I heard over 30 years that these communities up north set the bush on fire so they could come to the Lakehead exhibition in Thunder Bay? I mean, it's a load of hogwash. They're asking me when they come within 3 days, when are we going home? They don't want to be here, right? Is it nice to be here for a little while and have some comfort that they maybe don't have at home? Of course, we would all be that way if that was the case, right? And that's perfectly normal. So I think there's like a huge amount of systemic racism that it's not just Indigenous; it's with people with mental health and addictions, right? And some of those compounding things. I've had it with my own mental illness, people looking towards me and treating me differently. So it's there, and it does affect people's ability to deal with a response if they're dealing with a whole bunch of this stuff and it causes more crisis. Two of the one of the things that has haunted me is twice, as in my experience, we've had an evacuee pass away on my watch, and it's a horrible feeling, because they should be safe here. We're supposed to keep them safe, and the stuff wasn't in place, obviously, that it had to happen, and I've had to deal with my own on that, because people were like, well, it just happens, I mean, it's their fault, and things like that, when that is not the case at all. And so yeah, that negative part can be very, very loud, especially on social media. But I think peaks and valleys are part of the problem, right? Like people forget about it and they don't realize the inherent bias and racism and stuff that already exists within the system. We only kind of see it when it spikes up, when there's a new big news story, or some horrible person decides to say something mean, which gets taken, the media takes it and runs with it.
There's a great phrase that says we and I'll use this impolitely, but every village had an idiot. The internet just actually got allowed them all to congregate together,
Yeah,
which they
I like
never
that
found
one.
each other before, and now they're all together in one thing.
Yeah.
So that was a fabulous discussion. I know we could
Thank
go into
you.
recovery, and I think I'm going to put it down on the chart for social capital and recovery for the next iteration of the special interest group, the next webinar. I think there's a lot of call for that. If anybody has any questions, nobody's
Mhm.
put one in the chat yet. Feel free to put it in the chat. There's only a few of us here and an AI bot, so if you want to just put up your hand, and then I will give you the floor to ask your question or type it in, and I can ask it on your behalf. While we're waiting for a question to show up, just um, when we talk about investments, it's taxpayer money. There's no other way to make
Mhm.
investments. How do we win that phraseology word, the nomenclature war of how do we put it in a context, or is there a context related to social capital, related to responsibility, related to trust, norms of reciprocity, fellow citizens? Do you think we're getting any better at framing the investment in it's just something good and ethical and moral to do? And oh, by the way, the trend is going up. Like this is frequency is increasing. Like this is not going away,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, do you think we're getting any better at that?
I don't see it. I think there's pieces that are good. I'm going to go back to something I learned in my when I took my social work courses at the college here. For every investment of at that time it was for every dollar you say, you invest now, you save $3. We know that, but we are not investing in the upfront supports, right? We're not investing in things ahead of time. When a response happens, all of a sudden there's millions of dollars, right? But what about taking those millions of dollars, investing in the community and building, allowing them to build up that capital and that networking and those relationships and that trust, right? We're going to save millions more dollars by putting that money ahead. But I don't think I'm not seeing, and I'm my time in government, I did not see it at all. And that was one of the most frustrating things was putting the resources and the money and the time into saying, let's focus on community building, community development, right? It has to start there. And how do we support that so that when something happens, guess what? We've put a bunch of things in place. Less people are going to fall through the cracks, and that means we're going to save a boatload of money. But what we do is we keep throwing money and grants and different things. And I'm not saying they're wrong; they're super helpful, but it's not sustainable stuff, right? It's one-time pieces. We need something else. We need to think outside the box. So I'm not seeing it the way I'd like to see it. Yeah, I think there's a lot more we could do at the community level.
And I see the same thing in the preparedness world where I spend most of my research time is when you have periodic preparedness grants that are offered to a community and they can buy a generator, that doesn't make the community more prepared. It addresses a single identified issue shortfall that may provide assistance in a very specific type of response for a very specific need. But we haven't invested. And there's a great piece on LinkedIn today, and I forgot to cut it. I was going to cut it and paste it into
Okay.
the chat, but it was all about relighting the discussion about the social determinants of health, the
Yes.
underpinnings of all of our are likely tied to all of our follow downstream social problems that exist in society are keyed back to social determinants of health. And this isn't new research. We've known it specifically and clearly for decades. The reasons that contribute to populations who live at a higher degree of vulnerability and a higher degree of stress. And then we pick them up and evacuate them necessarily due to a wildfire and drop
Yep.
them into a community that doesn't have that level of stress and that level of social ills and problems. And then we have negative problems. We have social backlash. We have a whole bunch of misunderstanding about it. And I think it was just, sometimes I think getting back to what we often refer to in my previous career as first principles of, you know, if somebody is hungry and they don't have money, how do you expect that evacuation to go? Right? Like,
Exactly.
they're already set up for failure. And now you're moving them away from their home. You're not giving them accurate information. They're away for weeks. They're in a foreign place they may not know without their support structure. And then we wonder why it's messy.
Yeah,
That's the part that
exactly.
sometimes astonishes
Exactly.
me. that it's very messy. We do have one question in there from Kristen. Do you see non-government organizations playing a larger role in community response in the future?
I know Kristen, and I'm
There
glad
you
she asked
go.
that question.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one of the things we need to invest into, right? Is that those non-governmental organizations, they do some really great work. 211 is amazing, St. John Ambulance, Red Cross, like they're all doing amazing work, but they're doing it with a lot of volunteers, right? So, if we could invest in them and maybe have a bit more paid staff to support those volunteers and recruit and train and do those kind of things, that would be wonderful. But even the staff, the places that have staff, I mean, it's never enough. They are not for profit. For some reason, we kind of be like, oh well, we don't need to give them money. We just need to give them a little bit of influx now and then, or a little bit of sustainable funding, and they'll figure it out because they're not for profit and they're do-gooders. They're do-good people, right? They'll figure it out. No, they need investment just as much as anybody else. The other thing is, I think there's a huge role for non-government and private to work together, right? Private industry is there, they want to help. And so I think there's some synergies between the two groups where we could, if we could link them up and have them work together. Private has often funded a lot of non-governmental organization projects and different things. So could we look at a scale, within, I'm just thinking of my own city, there's quite a few different large conglomerates here. Could they provide some immediate support for certain things and do it through an NGO, right? So that they may not be the experts in that company on how to deliver it, but they want to help. So if we kind of build those synergies, I think that would be absolutely amazing to see. And again, need some support and funding to do it.
And the one point that I want to make is part of the research I did back in 2022 during the pandemic to kind of understand the supports and whether people were getting their supports was a small not-for-profit who, and their role was to provide showers and sandwiches, as she called it, to the unhoused. No
Mhm.
questions asked. Come on in, go in there, grab yourself a shower, grab a sandwich, out you go, no worries. Now, pandemic comes along, the government imposes a bunch of rules about PPE and taking down names. Well, if you've ever tried to get somebody's name who's unhoused, you're going to get Wayne
Mhm.
Gretzky, Phil, whatever. You're going to get whatever name that
Yep.
you need to fill a spot.
Yep.
This not-for-profit had no money, which contrary to belief, they're not sitting on millions of dollars in their bank account. And they had no PPE, and the government didn't give them the PPE, but the government imposed the rules on them.
Hmm.
They called the local power generation company, a private company in this, and the company just said, "What do you need and where do you need it?" And for the entire year
Awesome.
and a half for the rest of the pandemic, while PPE restrictions were on, they just picked up the phone and the local company just dropped it off at their front door. No receipts, no bills, no nothing, no questions.
Amazing.
And what I loved about the story is nobody was looking for an award. Nobody wanted recognition. They didn't want it published. I only found out about it because I had interviewed them and asked them how did they manage with these restrictions. And I think that's a prime example. We have one other question from Maya. How do you and before I ask this question, we are over time. For those of you who want to drop off, I absolutely understand. If you want to stick around for a little bit longer, we're going to answer Maya's question. Then going to close up, shut off the recording, and I'm happy to stick around if somebody wants to have a off the record conversation about this issue. So Maya's question is, how do you think mentorship opportunities could be better supported for organizations and individuals coming into the field?
Oh, that's so huge. And I'm going to tell you, like, most of the things I've learned is because I watched other people. I listened to other people. I had great mentors. There was two ladies at the Red Cross that I just, I took everything they said and, brought it into my own focus and kind of came up with my own ways. So we definitely need to support that because there's a lot of folks coming in from the field who are coming straight from, university and maybe not necessarily have kind of seen the field, if you will. And EM is one of those great fields where you can go into so many different things, right? There's research, logistics, operations, all these, finance, all these kind of things. So but it's when you're dealing with responses and you're dealing with planning and you're dealing with communities and real people, it's very different, right? So I think we need to find the mentors and we need to support the mentors. And I would love to see like a mentoring program for people who are coming new into it. Now, again, time and money. But wouldn't it be wonderful if that was a part of what we just did? It became the strategy of what we did. I think we also have an opportunity to seek out kind of unofficial mentors, right? Like there's people within this field, and I think growing your network. So as an example, I found out about social capital and you through LinkedIn. I had never kind of had that language before. I didn't know who you were, and I found you on LinkedIn, and so kind of seeking those out, right? And kind of never stop learning. But yeah, I would love to see something where we could, mentor the next crew coming in, because a lot is up here. It's not all written down. Where it is written down, sometimes it's on a shelf and nobody's pulled it out in 20 years and it's still actually applicable if they look. But a lot of stuff is up here. We're seeing that in the wildland firefighting, right? A lot of the people who had the knowledge and the skills that were only kind of in their head have retired. And we've got, crews that are being led by people who don't have the historical knowledge and that, gut instinct to work and showing others how it can be useful. So I think we're doing a disservice to the people coming into the field, and we're setting them up for failure by not having those mentoring opportunities and not trying to think of like, what does being a new hire in an organization and you're an emergency management professional look like when stuff hits the fan? Because that's different than sitting in a classroom and reading and talking to people.
Exactly. And I just want to add to that, to my comment there before we close, is that I'm an adjunct professor in disaster and
Mhm.
emergency management. I have quite a number of students who, of late, the demographics are we have a larger proportion of students who are coming directly out of school. And what I mean is
Yeah.
they've done a bachelor's degree, they've gone into a graduate program, and they have no experience anywhere. And so they're leaving the graduate program looking for their first full-time employment.
Yeah.
They don't know where to look. They don't know what the system looks like. They don't know what interests are out there. They don't know what the needs are of the community. And what I find is when we have to better organize in the community what our needs are for the new graduates. And I don't mean from an educational perspective. I think we do a good job of providing the great theories and ideas behind it.
Mhm.
And like you said, experience is the best teacher once you understand the world around you and what's going on. But
Yeah.
we don't say to people, this is what's available out there. When you go into the field, when you show up to look for your first job, the only thing available is not just what you see on the job board, right? So you may, entry level positions may be in the planning team. Well, great. Get into the planning team and then get out there and meet a bunch of people and
Mhm.
understand the world around you and understand but we don't have that mentorship. I think some of the programs and the school that I belong to has a paid intern program
Yeah.
where one of the selections that they can do is the student can try to find a paid intern for their part of their graduate work. But again, that's a paid intern. And when
Mhm.
we look at governmental budgets, there's not necessarily intern
A
funding,
lot of them.
but there's funding to say, I'm just going to take a month and I'm going to shadow you because I need to understand the
Yeah.
world. I need to understand the thing around us, et cetera. But we could go on forever for
Yes.
that. Sharon, thank you very much for taking the time out
Thank
of your
you.
day to join us. It was incredibly informative. I know that we're going to do this again, and I know we're going to talk about recovery sometime in the next 3 or 4 months. But on behalf of the International Social Capital Association, I want to thank you for showing up. It was an absolute pleasure to have a conversation.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me, and thanks for all the great work you're doing.